Hello and welcome to Books Up Close. I'm Chris Lloyd. This is the close reading show for writers, readers, and anyone interested in language. In today's episode, I talked to Saleem Haddad about his new novel, Floodlines. Saleem was born to an Iraqi-German mother and a Palestinian-Lebanese father. His writing spans novels, short stories, essays, film, and television. His debut novel, Guapa, won the Polari Prize and was awarded a Stonewall Honor. It's a brilliant book. You should have read it by now. His second novel, Floodlines, will be published by Europa Editions in February. Welcome, Saleem. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm serious. I've been screaming about Guapa for years to everyone that will listen.
Great, thank you. That's really, it's funny because I feel like Guapa is something of like a cult hit. Like people who read it really, really love it and kind of, or maybe those are just the people that I'm exposed to. I don't know.
And ever since I've been waiting for book 2. So now it's here.
It's here, yes.
It's here. Before we delve into this one, Floodlines, which is also a beautiful cover. People won't see it, but I've got it right here. What do you think about close reading? How do you feel about it? What's your relationship to it?
Well, I've taught a few seminars around global queer literature, and so we've done some close readings during those seminars. But I guess my introduction to it would have been when I was in London, and I began to seriously take up the idea of writing fiction. I took a 6-week course with the author Jonathan Kemp. And that was the first time that I was exposed to close reading. And it was really useful as a practice to learn, to break down the architecture of a narrative in order to understand the mechanics of it, how it's working, what the author is trying to do, how style, the choice of words can tell us so much about either the emotional landscape of the character or the story. And so that's kind of my first exposure to close reading. I've never done it on my own writing, by the way, so I'm slightly nervous about that.
No, I don't think you need to be nervous. I think it's always everyone that I've spoken to so far has found it strange, but then they're like, wait, I wrote this. I did that. Did I mean to do that? I don't know. And there's something quite fascinating for me about that.
Because for me as a writer, I work and I edit from a very subconscious gut instinct. So I don't often go back and try and understand the machinery underneath in a more analytical way, but I'm excited to do that now.
Yeah, we'll find out. So the passage I've chosen is from like quite near the beginning of the book. It's like 3 pages in, and we'll dig into that. But like we're in one of the main characters' minds. For those who haven't read it yet, we kind of flip between different people in this family, and this is like a really early on kind of like flood of ideas from this character at the very beginning. And I thought it would be an interesting part to talk about. So I wonder if you'd be okay reading it first and then we can delve in.
Sure. So it's a kind of a polemical interior monologue of this character called Nizad, who is a war journalist. And this monologue was triggered by a phone call with his mother, where she asks him if he's had any work trips recently. And this, I think, is about maybe a third or halfway through the monologue. With the right spin, a government could push the news of a massacre off the headlines. How could he tell his mother that it was more moral to sell his body than to sell his soul for some bullshit idea of the truth? He no longer believed that journalists were truth seekers. They were carriers of the apocalypse, scavengers for a story, desperate for clicks, exposing global misery to pad their pockets, leading the masses down a whirlpool of clickbait, the curators of an assembly line of death that floated down social media feeds and quickly disappeared, until everyone forgot what it was they were so angry about, only that they had a fireball of rage inside of them, throbbing and ready to explode. He saw it in his own feed, the way news drifted down his timeline like the flow of a river. Death, fires, war, floods, famine, sex, malnourished children in Yarmouk, malnourished women in Beverly Hills, swiping left, swiping right, chat rooms, saunas, jerking off to a sea of changing faces, sucking off one man, fisting another. What else to do in this ungovernable world but master control over his body? What an achievement. The glaciers were melting, but he completed 50 double unders without breaking form. Palestine was being disappeared, but he doubled the weight of his snatches in a month. The Islamic State dissolved the concepts of Syria and Iraq, but his quads were indestructible. The Assad regime was starving hundreds of thousands, But if he ate nothing but boiled chicken for 3 days, he could glimpse the outline of his abs under the right lighting. How could he tell her that sex was salvation?
Thank you so much. And the passage keeps on going, by the way, but I thought we have to like draw a line at some point. And the next line is quite intense, and I was like, maybe we'll just stop here.
We'll stop there. Yes, I had to fight for that last line to be kept
Oh,
in. Actually,
really? That's interesting. Yeah.
yeah.
Well, listeners, when you get to the book, you'll you'll see what we're talking about. But this real kind of like flow of language, of ideas, like it's really early in the book to be so kind of like immersed in this character's like point of view and his world, right? And I'm interested that it is in like third person, like all of these sections are in third person rather than first. And I don't know whether it'd be worth starting there, right? At what point did you feel that you wanted to do kind of like dipping in through kind of focalization rather than like I?
Sure. So actually, like you mentioned, this novel is written from multiple POVs and multiple characters within the family, and I had the most trouble with Nizar's POV. And first person was not something that I wanted to do for him. I wanted some distance between the reader and the character because Nizar himself is quite closed off in some ways, and he has all these walls up, and so the first person POV wouldn't work for what it was that I wanted to do. And initially, I actually wrote his chapters in the second person perspective, so you. So this monologue was initially written in the you, and I felt that that gave some distance, but it wasn't giving me what I wanted. So I ended up settling on the close third POV, which works better because it's in line with the other characters, which were always very clear to me that they were going to be in the third person. So I think it works because it creates some distance, but the reader is also absorbed into the character's consciousness because it's a very close third POV. And I think if I had written this in the first person, I think, especially for Nizar's perspective and particularly for this section, I think it would have been maybe a little bit sentimental and pleading with the reader. And I think by not having an I in there, it's a conversation between Nizar and himself. So there's kind of this alienated perspective where he's observing himself rather than telling someone else about himself, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, interesting. Because we are like I don't know, when I read this, you read quite quickly through this section, right? Because it's this long, kind of drawn out bit. It's over like 2.5 pages with like no paragraph breaks whatsoever. And you really kind of get sucked in. But you have to also remind yourself as a reader, like, wait. Like I don't agree with that. Or like that's not my position, right? That's this other person's position. And I think there's some really interesting play between like, yeah, oh, I agree. Like with the right spin, a government could push a news massacre off the headlines. Like, yes, we know that, but then like later on being like this terrible thing was happening, but now my body's like really ripped, right? And you're like, wait, what is this moral universe you're drawing us into, right? And I think there's something quite interesting about using that close third person
Yeah.
to do that with the right spin. The right spin is his language, right? Is Nizar's language, not the narrator. How could you tell his mother it was more moral to sell his body than to sell his soul for some bullshit idea of the truth, right? You can hear his language filter through the narrator, which I think is like fascinating when authors do that. He no longer believed that journalists were truth seekers and so on, right? Like you really get a sense of his moral universe, his viewpoint really early on here.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that he's a journalist, and so I think he tries, like I think what is happening in this passage is that he's trying to create a distance between himself and his thoughts, but there's this tension there because you can feel him get lost inside his own thoughts, especially the longer ones that kind of drift in, and then you see his emotion kind of punching through what he is trying to provide us while he's trying to provide us with this quite clinical analysis of the situation. You can see the rage and the frustration kind of punch through the narrative at various points, even as he tries not to. He gets emotionally swallowed up by it.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's almost like he's following an idea down. He has to like take the idea as far as it can go, right? It's, like now he started to be like, well, look, sex is an escape, right? It's a way to like embody when the world feels so disembodied. But it's almost like the argument he's telling, he's almost convincing himself to, right? He's having to like, he's like, let me take this thought to the end. And then you're like, well, we've gone really far here, Nizar, from where you started off.
Yeah. And I think partly it's because he is also aware of his own, I wouldn't say hypocrisy, but he's aware of like the logical conclusion of the fatalistic conclusion of this argument that he's kind of, this rabbit hole that he's kind of fallen into, this self-optimization in the face of global collapse. So even when he says what an achievement, that's kind of, there's a bitter irony in that, and he's almost making fun of himself because he knows that this is ridiculous, but still he does it.
Yeah, what an achievement is a great little, with like the exclamation mark as well, right? What an achievement. You're like, is that irony? Is that him? Like how much of this story that he's telling does he believe? Right, because most of the novel, to zoom out just a tiny bit from close reading, is about what people believe in, like what kind of stories they're willing to tolerate in the world, what stories they tell about themselves, about each other. So it's really interesting that we begin here with the kind of the stories that he doesn't believe anymore, right? That the government might spin or that other journalists might spin, and then how you narrate the self, right, in relation to that. And he's doing it also in a very like lyrical way in parts of this, right? Mother, more moral, sell, soul, bullshit. Like there's lots of alliteration, there's lots of sibilants running throughout here. I could pull out so many examples: carriers, apocalypse, scavenger story, pad, pockets. Sound wise, he's really pulling us through, or you're pulling us through. And it's always interesting to think like how much of that is part of his like rhetoric versus how much of that is like you like pulling us into his mind and like tricking us a little bit.
So I mean, I think I actually wrote this quite late in the process. So I had already written pretty much all of Nizar's storyline by then. And then this came to me a few years ago, maybe like 2 years ago, and I wrote it down very, very quickly, this whole thing. And then there was a lot of editing to make sure that I could get the rhythm and emotion that I wanted. So lots of moving sentences around, coming up with different words to make sure also that the sounds were the sounds that I wanted. And initially, this section came in the later part of Nizar's narrative. And then when I was editing, I realized that actually this would be a very good introduction to Nizar as a character, because also it leaves the reader with questions about how did this person become the way that he is. So within the first 3 pages, you already have this clear insight into this tension and this complexity within the character.
Yeah, I think when I read it, I was like, did Saleem write this in one foul swoop? Because it feels so unfolding, right? And it is this like stream of thought and feeling. It feels like one of those things that feels supernatural and unfolding. But as you've just said, actually, it requires a lot of moving around, a lot of like word changes and stuff. It's quite an interesting, it's a great thing to see like the effect of it and the work behind.
Yeah, I mean, the melody and the beat was something that was very important for me when I was writing this, because there was kind of a beat that I was working towards when I was writing. And funnily enough, when I was working with my editor on this passage, she was working with a very different beat in mind. And so there was this point of tension initially where the edits that she was doing were disrupting the beats that I had grown accustomed to. And I was working on rules of three, and then she preferred to work with like a two beat. So I can give you an example. So like in the original passage, I had written swiping left, swiping right, chat rooms, saunas, jerking off to a sea of changing faces, kissing one man, sucking off another, fisting a third. Where she cut that last bit, so it says jerking off to a sea of faces, sucking off one man, fisting another. And she wanted sort of the shorter beat, whereas I wanted something that it was a bit more run on. So a lot of it was very much working with this internal beat in my head around the.
Yeah, which is like really fascinating, right? In one part, he's kind of describing how journalists are. We'll come back to the metaphors that he uses for them, but this kind of like the stream of information, right, on our social media feed, the way news drifted down his timeline, like the flow of a river, death, fires, war, floods, famine, sex, which he's seeing as a bad thing, right? This kind of like gathering, amassing of different things. But then he does the same, right? He then lists 2 sentences later all of these sex acts, and then he gets us to like Palestine and Syria and Assad. You're like, wait, the very thing that you hate about social media, right, about the kind of way that news is delivered to us, is now the thing that you're replicating in your language. So that beat thing, that rhythm is quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the run-on sentences were really important, especially the run-on sentence about the one that starts with "they were carriers of the apocalypse" and talking about social media feeds, etc. I feel like that I really wanted that sentence to do what the social media feed itself does, right? So there's like a heavy, like extended cumulative sentences, and then they kind of run on, and then you kind of forget what the first part of the sentence is, which is kind of what he's saying, you know. So it kind of mimics doom scrolling in a way, and I wanted this kind of breathlessness and saturation to come through. But on that comparison that you're talking about, where he talks about the glaciers melting, but then he can do 50 double unders, etc. I think for me, I think it was something that I had begun noticing, and I think there's a lot also theoretically that's been written about this self optimization in the face of global collapse, and the kind of rise of like fitness influencer culture and health culture and that kind of thing, especially as the world is sort of exploding and you know the glaciers are literally melting. And so I kind of wanted to bring that out in a sense of, for him, it's in the face of this uncontrollable world, the one thing that he can do is control his own body. And that's kind of the philosophical hinge of this passage, where sexuality and fitness become methods of controlling your environment. But there's also a lot of hypocrisy there, which he is aware of being a journalist. And so I think he's kind of jumping between the two.
Right. And this thing about control just made me think, obviously the book is called Floodlines, right? And there are various floods that we get introduced to, both literal, historical, metaphoric, and so on. But like, it's interesting that formally you're also working with the kind of flood of language really early on, which I think it makes also really good sense that this is at the beginning, that actually the flood of thought, the flood of language in its uncontrollability, even while he's trying to control his body, which doesn't work, right, for him. Like, it doesn't actually solve the thing he thinks he's trying to solve. And like, I'm interested in the kind of metaphors that you use in that bit. Like, they were carriers of the apocalypse, scavengers for a story. They led masses down a whirlpool of clickbait, the curators in an assembly line. Like, it's such a mishmash of metaphors, of images, right, from like the natural to the technological to the, I don't know, to like workers and stuff. I'm really interested in how he's pulling from all these different kind of registers.
Mm-hmm. So there are, I guess, three things, right, that I was working with here in terms of imagery. One is I wanted, there's this sense of dehumanization that's happening in this passage. So he's dehumanizing journalists and kind of vilifying them. So you see them as like, scavengers, carriers of the apocalypse, etc. So I kind of wanted that imagery to be there. And there's a certain, of course, like a capitalistic logic to it as well, like for them to pad their pockets, etc. So suffering becomes something that is commodified. And I also wanted, like, linked to that capitalist image, this industrial image, so something like assembly line of death. But then I wanted this idea of, again, to go back to what you were saying about floods, I wanted this imagery of like things, like especially water-based metaphors that will kind of demonstrate something that's a bit uncontrollable. So whether it's talking about a sea of faces or a whirlpool, I don't know if he talks about a river of something at some point, a river of death. I'm not sure. So there are these three things that I was kind of working with in the text, in this passage specifically.
I'm always interested when language moves around. One version of a metaphor could easily just follow the same kind of like natural images, right? But here you're really like pushing them against each other in a way that makes us, I guess, look at them a bit differently, or makes us look at them as metaphors, right? That these are metaphors of his, that he's really, really like not overselling, but really pushing what journalists are, right? Carriers of the apocalypse, not just like harbingers, but like carriers, like they're the ones bringing it to us. Scavengers for a story, they're not just out there finding them. They're scavengers, but you're like, but you also did this for so long. Is that like was your career? And part of the novel as a whole is like trying to find the truth, kind of this family, right? Trying to figure out, there are so many lies and hidden things that we find out by the end, that it's like, are these all bad things, right? Is someone looking for a story? Is someone trying to give us information always the curators of an assembly line of death? Do you know what I mean? Like, there's these real extremes for him that very early on you're like, yeah, to hell with journalists, and you're like, wait, is that what I believe?
It's too far. Yeah. Yeah, because I think for me, the novel, or one of the key themes of the novel, is around the stories that we tell ourselves of our past in order to absolve ourselves or justify our actions or make it easier for us to wake up in the morning and get out of the house. And what happens when we're confronted with alternative versions of that history, which I think is something that is very common. And for Nizar, I mean, so I was never a war journalist, but I worked in aid work, so I worked in war zones. And one of the first things that you learn in war zones is that there's no one single narrative of what's happening. Everyone has their own narrative, and when you're in the midst of that, it's a very confusing and scary idea to be able to hold space for these different narratives rather than kind of try and find a single truth amongst them. And I think that Nizar is really at the, he's a burnt out journalist and he's kind of tired of carrying the complexity of all of these different narratives. And I think this is a very easy narrative that he's allowed himself to fall into, even as we know by him saying what an achievement. He doesn't believe in it himself. He realizes it's simplistic. But it's the one thing that in that moment in time allows him to get up in the morning and continue his day.
Is that the idea of like there's no one version of this story? Is that why you wanted to tell the novel through these multiple narrators? Is that part of that?
Definitely. I mean, I think it was I don't think I could have written the story from a single narrator's perspective. It just wouldn't have worked. And I wanted to have the close third person rather than like an omnipresent narrator because I wanted the reader to also go on that journey as well, where you're in different characters' minds, and then slowly the wider canvas is clear. At the end of the novel, you have a sense of the wider canvas, but when you're in the novel and you're reading from one perspective, you're only getting a very zoomed in detail of the thing. And then slowly the picture is built. The picture of this family is built for you. Once you make your way through the novel, it starts to click into place like a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, and the people who, I don't know, this is just me, the people who you immediately feel sympathy with, like that changes. And the people who at the beginning you're like, oh my God, I know this person. This is, like this person is doing my head in. But by the end of the book, you're like, oh wait, actually, no, I'm with them now. Like their politics are now my politics. There's some interesting circles that go around.
Well, for me, it was a process also because I had to understand the motivations of the characters. I needed to understand why they behaved this way. So it was a process of discovery for me as well as I was writing the novel to understand, like, why is this character so adamant about this one particular thing? And just kind of, and then I work through her story, and then I understand, oh, this is why, this is her emotional logic. This is what made her who she is. So it was a process of discovery for me as a writer that was very fun as well.
Good, yeah, and you definitely feel that as the book goes on. The line that also kind of stands out: we've gone from malnourished children in Yarmouk to malnourished women in Beverly Hills, which is like already an interesting, comparison. The very next sentence is swiping left, swiping right, chat rooms, saunas, jerking off to see if it. You're like, okay, we're in a very different register and world, right? With kind of like these explicit details. Next sentence, what else to do in this ungovernable world but master control over his body? We go from that really fast list of sex acts, as you were saying, to a much slower sentence, right? The sentence slows. And also, what else to do in this ungovernable world? Like much longer, like you really have to slow down, right? And this ungovernable world, like that's like one of the novel's theses as well, right? But it's interesting that like he uses that language here after coming from sucking off one man, fisting another, which is so like blunt and direct, right? To this much different language. I'm interested always in those contrasts.
Well, so the irony of something like malnutrition that appears as both a war crime and also like a lifestyle pathology was always very interesting to me because I would see it on my own social media feed, and it would just be very bizarre that these two things that are kind of similar but also like on the extreme sides of inequality. And I kind of wanted to bring that to this, but I think putting together, for example, the idea of malnourished children and then bringing in like this discussion of sex, I think also is very, very uncomfortable for obvious reasons and kind of makes the reader feel this sense of like this real sense of tension, or like, this is not right. These two things cannot be so close together in the narrative. But actually, so much of it mimics also the way that we like experience a lot of this imagery online. When you're scrolling through your social media feed, you kind of, go from these pictures of these children that are suffering really horribly, and then you jump on to this like image that is meant to make you feel aroused, and it's a very uncomfortable feeling that you're left with, even at a very subconscious level, that you as the viewer might not necessarily be aware is happening. And I wanted the text to do something similar.
And it definitely does. I mean, I experience that every day on social media. I'm like, this is it's whiplash, right? It's like the whiplash of content, and I think it's interesting for you to formalize that on the page as well, right? To turn that into like a formal question, and you do it most through this thing, but this also this other thing, and you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 of those buts in a row. The glaciers were melting, but he completed 50 double unders. Palestine was being disappeared, but he doubled the weight. This repetition of the same sentence structure as well, I think, is really like, it's for emphasis, but it's also like it makes it more and more uncomfortable. Like usually, like a repetition of emphasis is like, oh, we really make the point stronger. But the more you build up of these comparisons, the more like, oh, icky I feel, the more confused I feel about this politics, right? And I think it's a really interesting structure to use.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and coming up with the examples for that was also very interesting, because I needed to, again, I was working very subconsciously, but I just needed to think like what could work. I mean, some were more clear, like, the Islamic State dissolved the concepts of Syria and Iraq. So you get the sense of these massive countries that are just overnight suddenly announced that they've disintegrated, versus his quads, which were indestructible. So it's kind of those were more obvious. And the same thing with like the Assad regime starving hundreds of thousands of people versus him starving himself so that he could glimpse his abs under the right lighting. So there was a lot that I was trying to also do to find relationships between the two images, enough so that they don't seem too out there and kind of unrelated.
Yeah. But even so, they still feel like intense, right? They still feel awkward. And they're even like this sound play, right? Of like the quads, that S that links to like the Islamic State, and even like Assad and abs. I don't know. In the same thing, you've got like even these like sound bouncing around, which I think is really interesting. And then you've got those 4 in a row, and then how could he tell her, his mother that is, that sex was salvation? Again, these rhetorical questions that he's asking himself through the narrator, right? But the really big question of, but sex and the body, it does cut through, it does make sense for him in this senseless world. And you're like, yeah, no, that is a good question, even though everything you've just said is absolutely wild. And as I say, like it goes on for another like half a page before it then snaps right back into the dialogue with his mother, right? We go from this like digression. It's not like in real time. You imagine him just pausing right on the phone and like having this long drifting thought. I just think it's a really interesting, that turn from the building up to this really piercing question.
You mean the piercing question that ends this passage that we're looking at? How could he tell her that sex?
Yeah,
Yes.
of this passage, yeah. Which, obviously there's some more repetitions that come after it, right? That he, how afterward, like you get more of the repetition as it goes on, but this question almost like punctures some of that rhetorical work.
And it brings us out a little bit, but I mean, it brings us back to what triggered it, which is, brings us back to the maternal, but it also brings us back to the conversation with his mother. That this is all of this thought process is happening while he's trying to find a way to answer his mother's question about, why, or what his last work trip was, or whether he should even tell her that he no longer does war journalism.
Yeah. I wonder, was there anything you noticed in this passage when we picked it? Is there when you were reading it back, or like now? Because I don't know, there's obviously like a long gap, right? When you finish writing a thing and then it comes into the world, it's a strange gap. But like, how do you see this passage now?
I don't know. I try as much as possible not to like, with the exception of what we've just done for the last 20 minutes, I try not to like analyze my own work too much. I really like this passage overall. I think I'm very proud of it. And I remember being proud of it when I first wrote it because I felt that it captured something that I was frustrated with in my own life and that I couldn't articulate. Even as I realized that it was a flawed argument, I just wanted the character to have that argument and hold on to it. I think I think for me the passage, I mean obviously it works with a lot of imagery, but for me there's something that I saw it as like again music as a beat. There was a tone that I was trying to go with, whether it was where I put the commas or the type of sounds that I wanted to make and what that would signify. Like kind of there's a lot of cynicism there, but there's a lot of punching as well, like clicks, scavengers, pockets, quads. Like those are punchy things. But then there's a lot of S's as well to kind of that has this kind of sneering feeling. And I think that kind of as I was reading through it now, I was aware of that, of the musicality of that as well.
It's fascinating. Yeah, I want to turn a little bit to ask you about your writing because you obviously said you obviously do some really interesting editing work and you worked with your editor closely in this passage. But like, do you have a particular setup when you write? Are you typing, handwriting? Is it the same time of day? Like, what is your writing life?
I tend to write early in the morning. That's when I feel like I'm at my clearest. So if I'm working on something, then I will try to consistently wake up very early in the morning and do a couple of hours of work, of writing before switching off and doing other things. So that's kind of how I like to start my day. But I usually don't go for more than 2 hours a day for a number of reasons. I have other lots of other things that I need to be doing. I work. I'm a freelance aid worker now, so I don't have the 9 to 5 that I used to have. But when I do take on a project, it's very intensive, and so it's very hard for me to maintain a consistent writing routine through that project. But what I try and do is my partner travels, and so when he travels, I often go into hibernation, and friends know that they're just not going to see me. So I move all of my stuff into the living room, and I just immerse myself completely in writing during that period. And I try to go once a year. I treat myself to like a personal writing retreat for 5 days. So I rent a house somewhere in the countryside where I can just immerse myself in reading and writing. So it's a mixture of trying to do regular early morning writing work as well as then these periods and blocks of quite intensive 1 week writing.
Do you save like the editing for like those intensive bits, or are you doing it as you like daily as well, or you just like get it out and then come back?
It depends. Every piece of work is different, but usually those 1 week periods are when I do a lot of very intensive editing, or when I'm starting the editing process, especially because that requires kind of taking a step back, looking at the piece as a whole, figuring out how things move in certain ways, and that process doesn't lend itself well to like the 2 hours a day writing period that I often have. So I try and arrange my writing retreats for that time when I need that space to be able to think more big picture.
Yeah, that's interesting. And you type rather than handwrite.
I do both. If I'm feeling stuck and I just want to often free write in the from the perspective of the character, I will do that by hand. So I have different notebooks for different writing projects, and I'll just do a lot of free writing in that notebook. But a lot of the time, also, my thoughts come to me when I'm on the move. And so, what I've done is I've created WhatsApp groups for each of my writing projects. And then I'll send myself an idea in the different WhatsApp groups because then it's organized a bit more. And I find it more trustworthy than like a notes app or something because I've lost work through the notes app. And I have these WhatsApp groups that are kind of labeled the name of the project, and then I use those to send myself ideas and thoughts.
And you're typing that or like voice notes and stuff as well.
Both depends. Yeah, it depends where I am, and sometimes when I'm driving, I'll get an idea, and then I'll have to try and figure out to send myself a voice note where I'm just talking into by myself to the car into the WhatsApp.
This is fascinating. I love to know how people do these things. You said a bit earlier about like the creative writing kind of course that you took. Were you thinking about writing long before that, or was that like the first moment that you thought like, oh, I can do this as a thing? But like, were you thinking about it as a kid? Were you a reader, a writer?
I was always a reader, and I was always very interested in storytelling. So I would kind of create with like my Barbies and my He-Man toys. I would create these storylines. I remember in high school I got into drama. I went to high school in Jordan, and I we didn't have writing or creative writing. That was not really an option for us. But there was drama, and that was my way to get into storytelling. And so I was very much into like a theater geek as a kid. And I remember reading A Midsummer Night's Dream because I had the idea to adapt it for a school play. And I just remember that was really where I realized, wow, I love this idea. I was working with this beautiful magical story that was very indulgent, which is kind of what I like, and trying to work within the constraints of like this amateur school play was very interesting because I had like five actors that I needed to work with. And that's when I realized I loved it. But I didn't really, my father was the idea of becoming a writer was not something that I could ever even bring up to him. And so I ended up studying economics and going down that route and then going into aid work. And it wasn't until my mid 20s that I started to think about writing as something that I could do and not just kind of admire as something for other people to do. But I always loved to read. I was always a reader.
I was going to ask, do you teach any lessons on creative writing that you'd want to share here?
I do occasional workshops, and what I like to do, it's not creative writing in the traditional way. It's I like to give a little bit of a spin on creative writing. So again, it goes back to close reading. So I like to use close reading as a springboard for understanding the mechanics and architecture of writing that is useful for creative writing workshops, because then we can look at how a certain passage advances character, or how to write dialogue in a certain way using real examples. I don't do it in a sustained way. So when opportunities arise for doing a seminar or a workshop, then I enjoy doing them. But I often find that when I'm in that creative writing or when I'm in that teaching headspace, I can't write. I don't think I could. It's something that I could be doing on a regular. I admire those that can, but it's not something I can do.
They're like kind of separate worlds in a way. Yeah.
For me, very much. There's this book called Craft in the Real World by, I think his name is Matthew Salasis, that is very interesting because I think it takes a political stance or slant to a lot of creative writing concepts that you would find in a creative writing workshop. And I think that's kind of what I use to help me think about how to structure a creative writing workshop in kind of an interesting way, one that incorporates politics a bit more in how we think about character and dialogue and setting and that kind of thing.
On that book is a really good suggestion, but there are other essays or books that you turn to on writing as practice. Are there things that you go back to or find useful?
There's nothing that I go back to. I remember reading, I mean, this is a bit cliche, but I remember it being an amazing book on writing by Stephen King. When I first thought to myself that, okay, maybe this is something that I'd like to pursue, I remember reading that book. And I do love Stephen King's books. And I think it was just fascinating. It was really fascinating and also inspiring about like the grit that you need as a writer and the consistency and the discipline that's required. I think that it's captured so well, and you can just tell that this is someone that loves stories, and it really comes through, and it's a very exciting book for any aspiring writer. And I remember Bird by Bird by Anne Lamott also being useful for me when I was writing. And I think it's again, it's very much about the need for discipline, but also empathy when you're writing. I think those are some that I recall fondly. I don't really return to many of those kinds of books though and reread them. I probably should.
No. I mean, you're doing well with whatever you're doing, but it's always interesting to like see those texts. both of which are great. I think they're great. The Lamotte book has got some like mad stuff in it, but I think it's also, she's like funny too about writing. You know, she's like, what do you, this isn't some mystical thing. It's just like, it's work. Just go do the work. What do you want from me? Like, I think there's a real prosaicness about her that I quite enjoy. Okay, my last question I ask everyone for book recommendations. You can recommend new things, old things, things not yet out, stuff that you can't stop rereading. Hit me with as many recommendations as you want.
Okay, so I mean, one of the books that I always push onto people is The Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa. I think it's one of the most beautiful pieces of literature. And I just find it so, and they teach it to Portuguese children in school, and I just find it so amazing. Like, and what a gift to be taught such an like a soul expanding book. I find it. When I was writing the early drafts of Floodlines, I would wake up and read a little bit of The Book of Disquiet every day because I just feel like it's consciousness expanding. So that's one that I would really recommend. I had a lot of anxiety. I suffered from like quite debilitating anxiety for about 2 years. And Pessoa was one of the few things that really helped calm me and kind of expand my sense of self. I see it as like it's not just lyrically beautiful, it's also just so expansive and surreal and philosophical. What other book could I recommend? So there's the book The Coin by Yasmin Zahir, which I absolutely loved. It's a book about this wealthy Palestinian woman who lives in New York City who slowly becomes obsessed with cleanliness. And on the surface, it's hugely readable and pleasurable, but I think underneath lurks something that's pricklier and harder to pin down. And what I really loved is this tension that Zahir sustains between meaning and meaninglessness in the novel. So it's as if the novel is constantly daring you to overinterpret it and then quietly slipping out of your grasp every time you try and do that. And I had the chance to speak with her for a podcast, and that resistance became even more apparent when I was in conversation with her. She's very kind of hesitant to analyze her own work or explain her own work or try and make the illegible legible. And I think the book is just a very interesting one. And I guess the final book that I would maybe recommend is one that I'm reading at the moment, and it's lesser known, but I'm absolutely loving it. I'm reading it in Arabic, but it's already been translated into English. In English, the title is called No One Knows Their Blood Type by Maya Al Hayat, and it's a very slim novel, but it packs a punch. It's a story about a woman who, after her father dies, she discovers that her blood type is different from her dad's in a way that could not have been inherited from her father. And she has a very very complicated relationship with her father, who was in the Palestinian resistance, but in the diaspora, and he's a very complicated character. She's a very complicated character. The family is very complicated. So it's about identity, and especially Palestinian diasporic identity, and it's about what it means to belong when you grow up in the diaspora. But there's a real emotional intimacy to the narrative that I'm very very much enjoying, and that's what I'm reading at the moment.
That's great. 3 lovely recommendations. Yeah, all 3 of those are good. So when you're writing, you do dip into reading others, because there are some authors I've spoken to that, like, when they're in the middle of a project, they won't read if they're writing prose, they won't read prose, or if they're writing poetry, they won't read poetry. But you find sometimes it's helpful.
Um, I mean, for Fernando Pessoa, also in that particular book, there's no real narrative. I think what I struggle with is more narrative, because I find it confusing when I'm crafting a narrative to then have this other narrative inside of me, or kind of competing with what I'm trying to. So I think that's what I struggle with. I then move towards more lyrical, stylistic novels. So I like Clarice Lispector, for example, is another example of a writer that I would read if I'm working on the first draft of something, where she doesn't work too much with plot, and the story isn't really there. It's more about the vibe, so to speak, that I really love about her, and the ideas.
Yeah, for sure. No, always like interesting to know Saleem, this has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and speaking with me today.
Thank you. I absolutely loved it. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Please subscribe if you haven't already, leave a review and share with people you know. You can also follow the show and me on Instagram at Books Up Close and on YouTube. And if you can, please do fill out the feedback form linked in the show notes. It's really helpful to us. You can get show transcripts and more information by subscribing to the Substack. This show is made possible by an Impact Accelerator Award from the University of Hertfordshire and the Arts and Humanities Research Council.